Warning, this podcast is for mature audiences only. In this podcast, I explore stories of darkness from history, myth, and legend. I am Dennis Sarah, and this is Evil. Cheltenham, England, January 1896. A 25-year-old unwed barmaid named Evelina Marmon gave birth to a daughter. She named her baby Doris. It was a struggle for unmarried mothers in Victorian Britain to earn a decent income. 3 decades earlier, the Poor Law Amendment Act of 1834 removed any financial obligation from the fathers of illegitimate children. Single mothers were forced to raise their children alone, in a society where single parenthood and illegitimacy were stigmatized. This led to the practice known as baby farming. Individuals acted as adoption agents. The baby's mothers were charged regular payments or a single upfront fee. Many businesses were set up to take in these young women and care for them until they gave birth. At that time, the mothers would leave, and their unwanted babies would be looked after by the agents until a home could be found. Of course, this was before government regulations designed to protect the children were created, before adoption agencies were closely monitored. Evelina could not care for a child on a barmaid's wage. She had come to a painful decision. Evelina had to give up Doris, at least for a while, and try to find someone to care for her. She planned to go back to work and, over time, save enough money to reclaim Doris. She placed an advertisement in the miscellaneous section of the Bristol Times and Mirror newspaper. It read, "Wanted, respectable woman to take young child." By an ominous coincidence, next to her own ad was another that read, "Married couple with no family would adopt healthy child, nice country home, terms £10. Just for a frame of reference, £10 in 1896 is equivalent to over £1,200 in 2017, or over $1,500. Not an easy amount of money to come by for a single mother. Evelina responded to the ad and wrote to a Mrs. Harding. A few days later, she received a reply that read, "I should be glad to have a dear little baby girl, one I could bring up and call my own." The letter continued, "We are plain, homely people, in fairly good circumstances. I don't want a child for money's sake, but for company and home comfort. Myself and my husband are dearly fond of children. I have no child of my own. A child with me will have a good home and a mother's love." Although in her response, Mrs. Harding stated, "I don't want a child for money's sake," she was a shrewd negotiator. Evelina asked to pay a more affordable weekly fee for the care of Doris, but Mrs. Harding would not move on receiving a one-time fee in advance. With not many prospects, Evelina reluctantly agreed to pay the full £10, and a week later, Mrs. Harding had arrived to pick up Doris. Evelina was surprised by Mrs. Harding's stocky appearance and advanced age, but she seemed affectionate towards Doris. Evelina handed over her daughter, a cardboard box of clothes, and the £10. Still distressed at having to give up care for her daughter, Evelina accompanied Mrs. Harding to the train station and continued to accompany her to the next station as well. When Evelina returned home, she was a broken woman. A few days later, she received a letter from Mrs. Harding saying all is well. Evelina wrote back, but never heard from Mrs. Harding again. What Evelina did not know is that Mrs. Harding was actually Amelia Dyer. There was no Mrs. Harding, and Dyer did not travel to Reading, as she had told Evelina. Instead, she went to 76 Mayo Road, Willesden, London, where Dyer's 23-year-old daughter, Polly, was staying. Amelia Dyer had lost her first husband almost 30 years prior. At the time, Amelia had already been trained in the baby farming business. She originally was training to become a nurse, when a midwife had taught her an easier way to make money. However, shortly after introducing Amelia to baby farming, her mentor had to flee the country. Apparently, if her mentor could not quickly find a family to adopt the baby, the child would end up passing away from neglect. Amelia Dyer continued the baby farming business in the absence of her mentor. Of course, she took the business to a whole new level of evil. At some point in her dark career, Dyer decided to dispense with the expense and inconvenience of letting the child die through neglect and starvation. Instead, shortly after taking possession of the baby, she would bring them back to her home and, without remorse, murder them. For years, Dyer continued her killing business and evaded the interest of the police. In 1879, after about a decade in the business, a doctor grew suspicious about the number of children who were in the care of Dyer. He had been called in to clarify their deaths. The doctor's suspicion eventually turned into an arrest of Dyer. Unfortunately, instead of being convicted of murder, she was sentenced to 6 months hard labor for neglect. With her prison time behind her, Dyer resumed her career. She did have short stays in mental hospitals due to her alleged mental instability. However, these stays seemed to coincide with the times Dyer needed to avoid the authorities and disappear for a while. Dyer was a former asylum nurse and knew how to act to ensure a somewhat comfortable stay at the mental hospital. It was during these years Dyer was abusing alcohol and opium as well. In 1890, a decade after her prison stay, Dyer was caring for the illegitimate baby of a governess. When the governess returned to visit the child, she became suspicious that the child she was presented was in fact not hers. When Dyer handed the child to the governess, she stripped the baby to see if a birthmark was present on its hip. The child she was holding did not have the birthmark. After the governess incident, the authorities became more suspicious of Dyer's business practices. However, Dyer had a well-timed breakdown and disappeared for a while. It was reported that around that time, Dyer had consumed 2 bottles of laudanum in what appeared to be a serious suicide attempt. However, because of her long-term opium abuse, she had built up a tolerance and survived the overdose. Of course, she did ultimately return to her unique form of baby farming. Dyer tightened up her operation and no longer involved doctors to issue death certificates. She simply disposed of the bodies herself. Naturally, the years of killing gained Dyer the attention of the authorities and the ear of parents seeking to reclaim their children. She was forced to relocate her family to different towns to stay ahead of the authorities. Over the years, she acquired various aliases. It must have been easy to create new identities in the late 19th century. and Dyer was good at it. That brings us back to 1896, with Evelina and her daughter Doris. Evelina the barmaid had handed her daughter Doris a cardboard box of clothes and 10 pounds to Amelia Dyer. Dyer, posing as Mrs. Harding, had agreed to care for the child. Although Evelina was heartbroken, she had fully expected to reclaim Doris when she was financially able. Unfortunately, she had unknowingly handed Doris to a killer. Dyer took Doris to her daughter's residence. Once there, Dyer located her weapon of choice, white edging tape used in dressmaking. She wound it twice around Doris's neck and tied a knot. Doris suffocated to death. It was reported later that Dyer had remarked, "I used to like to watch them with the tape around their neck, but it was soon all over with them." Dyer wrapped the body in a napkin. Some of the clothes Evelina had picked up were kept by Dyer, and the rest were pawned. When Dyer had paid the rent that month on her daughter's residence, she gave the landlord a pair of child's boots as a present for her little girl. The day after little Doris had been killed, a 13-month-old little boy named Harry Simmons was taken to Mayo Road. However, Dyer had run out of edging tape, using the last on Doris. Undeterred, Dyer removed the tape from Doris's corpse and strangled little Harry with it. On April 2nd, Dyer stacked both bodies and a few bricks into a carpet bag and threw them into the river. Unbeknownst to Dyer at the time, 3 days earlier a child's body was found in the river. It was wrapped in a bag and weighted down with bricks. The body was later identified as Helena Fry. The detective force at Reading Borough were investigating little Helen's death. Detective Constable Anderson had some evidence to go off of. A label from Temple Mead Station. Under a microscopic analysis of the wrapping paper, he deciphered a faintly legible name, Mrs. Thomas, and an address. The evidence had led the constable to Dyer, but he had no solid evidence to connect her directly with the crime. Detective Anderson placed Dyer's home under surveillance, knowing from further investigation that Dyer would disappear if she became aware of the eyes on her. With the help of a young woman acting as a decoy, police raided Dyer's home on April 3rd, which just happened to be Good Friday. Now, no human remains were found, but the police were struck by the stench of decomposing human flesh. However, the police recovered plenty of other evidence: white edging tape, telegrams regarding adoption arrangements, pawn tickets for children's clothing, receipts for advertisements, and letters from mothers inquiring about the well-being of their children. The police estimated that in the last few months, at least 20 children had been placed in the care of Amelia Dyer. When the authorities estimated how many children Dyer may have killed over the decades, they came to a number of about 400, making her one of the most prolific murderers ever, and perhaps the most prolific female murderer ever. Dyer was arrested on April 4th and charged with murder. Her son-in-law, Arthur Palmer, was charged as an accessory as well. The police dredged the river and recovered 6 more bodies, including Dyer's last victims, Doris Marmon and Harry Simmons. All the recovered bodies were strangled with white tape. Dyer later told the police, "That was how you could tell it was one of mine." 11 days after handing her daughter to Dyer, the heartbroken Evelina identified Doris's remains. At trial, Amelia Dyer stated her daughter, Polly, and her son-in-law had no knowledge of Dyer's killings, that she had acted alone. The only defense Dyer offered was insanity. However, the prosecution argued successfully that her bouts of mental instability had been a ploy to avoid suspicion. It took the jury only 4.5 minutes to find her guilty. Dyer was executed by hanging June 10th, 1896. A day earlier, the charges against her daughter Polly were dropped. Of course, the story doesn't quite end there. 2 years after Dyer's execution, railway workers inspecting carriages found a package. Inside the package was a 3-week-old girl. Though she was cold and wet, she was still alive. The mother stated the baby had been given to a Mrs. Stewart, along with 12 pounds. She had picked up the baby and apparently dumped her on the next train. It is believed that Mrs. Stewart was actually Polly, the daughter of Amelia Dyer. Thank you for listening. If you'd like to hear more of Evil Podcasts, please go to evilpodcast.com. Well, this is only the second episode. Our first one is there as well. And who knows, by the time you listen to this, we may have several out there. You can also go to iTunes and subscribe there. Rate and review us would be great. We're also available on Stitcher and Google Play. And if you'd like to become a supporter, you can order a t-shirt from our store online. Just go to evilpodcast.com. Or you can support us through Patreon at patreon.com/evilpodcast. Thank you for listening.